All right, breaking news. Pharmaceutical giant Pfizer just announced moments ago that its coronavirus vaccine is 95% effective.
A second vaccine is now on the horizon. It could eventually free us from this pandemic.
Developed in record time, scientists raced to free the world from the grasp of COVID-19. But just as vaccines started rolling out, new threats emerged, casting a shadow of doubt.
There is a realistic possibility that this variant may be associated with increased mortality.
Public health officials are trying to contain an outbreak of one of the more contagious new variants.
They go by names like B117, B1351, and P1. What is becoming abundantly clear is these new variants are more infectious, spread more easily, and can trigger deadly outbreaks. Virus mutation is normal, but near the end of 2020, Southeast England became a hotspot for a new coronavirus variant that started to spread rapidly. It had 23 mutations. For scientists at the University of Cambridge in the UK, the search was on.
We didn't know that you could find viruses with so many mutations in one virus.
In the hunt for answers, world-renowned virologist Ravi Gupta has two roles, one in the lab at Cambridge and the other down the road at Addenbrooke's Hospital. It was here he saw a cancer patient who held important clues. The person was affected with the coronavirus, but because his immune system was weakened by chemotherapy, he couldn't get rid of it. He was sick for more than 100 days, allowing the virus to replicate again and again.
We'd been learning for a year that this virus didn't change, it was always the same, there were a few mutations here and there, and yet in this person we saw just the most dramatic shifts you could imagine.
A virus's strategy for survival is to multiply by making copies of itself, but the copies aren't always identical. As SARS-CoV-2 replicates, small copying mistakes known as mutations can happen. On average, a strain of this particular coronavirus can produce 1 or 2 random mutations per month. Some have an advantage over others, helping it survive. Others don't. These mutations, when combined with natural selection, allow viruses to quickly adapt and increase the likelihood of being passed on to the next generation, while mutations that make the virus less fit are likely to die out. In the case of the B117 variant found in the UK, many researchers believe that it evolved within a single immunocompromised patient. People with weakened immune systems can have trouble fighting and killing the virus, allowing it to continuously replicate for weeks or months, generating more and more mutations.
It's just a race against who can develop quicker, the virus or us.
Stephen Kemp is a research associate at University College London. He worked with Gupta, tracking the evolution of the virus in that cancer patient who became chronically infected with the coronavirus.
He was then transferred to our hospital, where he stayed in our care for about 100 days. And what we did was, over those 100 days, at sequential time points, we took various different samples. And what we noticed was the patient was developing a number of different mutations.
For example, around day 66, after treating the patient with 2 doses of convalescent plasma, the virus's genetic structure started shifting.
It seems like after he'd received a specific therapy, which is called convalescent plasma, which is plasma that's been taken from patients who have defeated COVID, when they're given to this patient, it seems that a number of mutations arose.
But one of the mutations we found led us to discover the B117 variant, because this mutation in our patient that had emerged in response to treatment actually was one of the key mutations found in the B117.
That key mutation is now known to make the variant more infectious.
There's not a whole lot of evidence to suggest that it's more deadly, just that it's more transmissible.
We were the first to actually show that in vitro that these mutations actually had a functional impact, and therefore this was a sign that the virus was not only evolving but actually doing things to overcome treatments that we were throwing at the virus.
And this is the virus spike protein here in blue, and it shows the interaction and how the virus is binding.
So we went from looking at one patient and then trying to understand how common was this mutation in coronaviruses from around the world. And that's where we found that there was this big cluster of hundreds of sequences from patients in the UK that not only had our mutation of interest, but had 7 other spike mutations. And this was unprecedented to see.
Chronic infections are rare, but there are a growing number of cases around the world showing evidence of immunocompromised COVID-19 patients accelerating viral evolution.
I tested positive for like a total of 9 times. That's brutal. That's almost like 2 months, right? Of testing positive and not going anywhere, doing groceries online, not seeing anyone, literally just being in our house.
It was the start of the pandemic, and Ottawa resident Brianne Quarrel couldn't catch her breath.
My youngest daughter had a birthday in March, and I was making her cake. And normally, I love to bake, love to cook, and I can do it standing, no problem. But I found myself taking breaks and having to sit down to ice her cake. And I said to my husband, I'm like, oh, thank God I can sit down to do this. I'm so tired. And he was like, well, that's weird.
The mother of 3 decided to go to the hospital, and in a 24-hour span, Coral went from needing an oxygen mask to being intubated. She spent the next 2 weeks on a ventilator.
Have you ever felt anything in your life like you did when you had COVID-19 and that struggle to breathe? What was that like?
No, I've never felt anything that bad in my life. The struggle to breathe was scary because I've always had this irrational fear, of drowning or suffocating. So when I couldn't get my breath, it felt like that's what it would be like to drown or to suffocate.
But Coral's health struggles started long before the pandemic. In 2018, doctors found a brain tumor. A year later, she was diagnosed with 2 autoimmune disorders. The 41-year-old falls into a category of people who have a compromised immune system.
And then COVID hit, and that just sunk the boat even further.
Immunocompromised people were not included in the COVID-19 vaccine trials, so there's very little data on the risks to them. It's currently unknown whether they'll even be able to have an immune response if they do get the shot.
What do we know about what happens to them when they get the vaccine?
I think if you have an immune compromising condition, you are exactly the population we want to get vaccinated, and I encourage you to do so.
Dr. Suman Chakrabarty is an infectious disease specialist at Trillium Health Partners in Mississauga, Ontario.
The really important thing, if you look at a place like Israel, is that we're seeing real-world evidence that the vaccine is very effective. And this is a population including young people, older people, as well as people with impaired immune systems.
New research on variants have undercut, but not eliminated hope that COVID-19 injections will end the pandemic. A report released in February suggested the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine can still protect against new variants. But the company noted its shot is a little less protective against the variant in South Africa, which may be able to escape antibodies.
What is the research showing about how effective these vaccines are against the variants?
So if you look in certain kind of test tube experiments, you'll see that the variant from South Africa, for example, does have a reduced response to the vaccines, especially AstraZeneca. But if you look more closely, you still have way more antibody than you need to neutralize it. So while this might be something we see in a chest tube, clinically, what we see in person, the person's still able to clear the virus enough that they don't get severe disease, and that's what I think is the most important metric for us to look at.
So taking a vaccine saves you from dying, which is the #1 reason to have a vaccine on a personal level. So that's fantastic news, and that seems to hold true even for some of the more worrying variants like the South African one. We are still seeing protection from severe disease and mortality.
Moderna and Pfizer are already working on booster shots against the B.1.351 variant.
So certainly if there are any additional mutations which will render the vaccines ineffective, then we'll have to pull up our bootstraps and work a bit faster.
Back in Ottawa, high-risk patients like Brianne Quarrel are worried. While she says she will get the vaccine when it becomes available to her, there is a chance that she could get infected with one of the new variants while waiting. It's a reality Quarrel can't afford to become true. It's been almost a year since she got COVID-19, and she's still suffering.
I still have quite a few lingering effects, to be honest. I still can't taste or smell. I lost most of my hair, so this is regrowth. I'm still not where I want to be. I'm better than where I was, but I'm still not that mom that I want to be.